Here. I'll tell you just very briefly about myself. Some of you have attended a webinar with me before, but my name's Christy Burcham. I do work here at Embroidery Online in Oklahoma City. I've been with Embroidery Online for about 9 years, but not consecutively. I've been here about a year in this run, but I had gone to school a few years ago, so previously I'd worked here for 8 years. So in total about 9 years with Embroidery Online, but I've been teaching machine embroidery for about 18 years. And yes, that's my entire adult life. I have 2 adorable kids, as you can see here, my daughter and my son, and most importantly for today, I'm passionate about embroidery. I'm really excited to share with you today, and I know you guys love embroidery as well. So let's get started with talking about tiling scenes. A Country Spring Lane is the collection, and the collection number is 12456 that we'll be using to talk about today. This particular collection is all embroidery. There's no applique in this particular collection, but we will talk about different collections, ones that have applique and ones that don't. I wanted to share with you a couple of people who worked on this project. Marian is the artist who drew this collection, and Brian is the digitizer, and together they made a great team in putting together this project. So Marian drew out the sketch, and the way she does these tiling scenes is she sketches the whole thing first, and then she scales it up to the size that we'll be using and breaks it up into tiles. But it takes a lot of thought and effort as she's designing this to make sure that each tile is also going to be able to stitch individually. When she's planning these out, she wants to make sure she doesn't end up putting 2 or 3 stitches of one color into one tile. So she really has to think about how those things get placed when she's putting it together. And Brian also, as he's preparing the digitizing, really considers how those pieces are going to have to go together. They also have to really work to make sure that the pieces are going to fit together when you stitch them together. And you'll see more about that as we look through how you actually stitch these pieces together. So what are the steps in putting together a tiling scene? Well, there are 5 major steps, and then we'll break each of these 5 steps down into smaller steps. The first thing that we're going to do is calculate the fabric. How much fabric do we need, and figure out what supplies we're going to need. Then we're going to embroider the blocks. Once all the blocks are embroidered, we'll stitch those blocks together. Once the blocks are all stitched together to form a top, we're going to quilt the layers together. And then finally, we'll do some finishing to those blocks. In our instructions that come with a tiling scene, it does provide fabric estimates for you. So we'll tell you you need 3 yards of background fabric in the collection instructions. One thing that you want to consider, though, is that this is an estimate because every hoop size is different. So even though we've calculated on average the approximate amount of fabric you're going to need, this may or may not be the optimal or exact amount you need for your machine based on the size hoop that you're using to stitch out the design. So, for example, I stitch on a machine that uses an oval hoop. And in order to stitch in this oval hoop, the minimum size fabric that I want to cut and to successfully embroider is 10 inches by 14 inches. So as you've gotten to know your embroidery machine, you know about how much space you need around the outside of that hoop to know what size you need to cut that piece. This is a good number to know just in general. If you do test sewing of your designs before you stitch them out, you want to know, how big do I need to cut this fabric so it fits my hoop? Being sure, as you can see in this picture, that we leave plenty of room around the outside for hooping this properly. We don't want to scrimp and have the fabric be too close to the edge because that's going to cause uneven results. We want a nice even amount of fabric all the way around the hoop. So for my hoop, I need 10 by 14. You'll want to determine for the hoop that you're going to be stitching on what size fabric piece you need to stitch. The next thing that you'll want to figure is how many hoopings can you get out of a yard. And again, this is a really helpful number to know even if you're going to be doing other types of projects. how many hoopings can I get out of a yard? Because even though when we hoop this, we need a big piece, we're going to cut it down to a much smaller piece. We can't figure the amount of fabric we need based on that small piece. We have to figure it based on how big of a piece I need to hoop. So for my 10 by 14, the way I have figured it is that I can get out of a 44 to 45 inch piece of fabric, you can typically get about 42 inches of usable fabric safely. So divide that in half, that's 21 inches of usable fabric when it's doubled. Knowing that, my 10-inch wide pieces, I can get 2 of those out of that 21-inch wide fabric. So I can get 2 out of the width, and then if it's 14 inches long, how many can I get out of a yard? Well, I can only get 2 out of 1 yard if I'm doing 14 inches. But if I need 3, it's just 1 1/4 yards. So that's a good number for me to always know in my mind, or maybe have it written down in my iPhone or in my notepad when I go to the store, to know how many hoopings can I get out of a yard or approximately yard. So I know I can get 12 hoopings out of a 1 1/4 yards. So for the background fabric for this particular project, there are 24 tiles. There are 24 tiles that have the main scene embroidery on them. So to get 24 hoopings, I need 2.5 yards of the background fabric. There will be some waste here. There's a little bit of extra fabric that I'm not using out of those 2.5 yards. That's going to be scrap, but I can't quite get a whole nother set of hoopings out of that. So I can use that for other projects. I can use it for other size hoopings, but I need that 2.5 yards to get my 24 hoopings. Now, what about the border fabric? This project actually has 24 main tiles and it has 24 border pieces. The border pieces are much smaller than the background tiles. However, if you want to keep things really simple and you don't mind buying extra fabric, which I'm always a fan of buying extra fabric, you can calculate it the same way. How many hoopings can I get? There are 24 pieces. I need 24 hoopings, so I need 2.5 yards of the border fabric. If I want to do it this way, I know that I'm just going to stitch 1 of those border pieces in every hooping. Now, there is a lot of waste this way. It depends on which is more important to you. Do you want to save time or do you want to save fabric? And it all depends on what your needs are. So if you want to save some fabric when doing those border pieces, which I imagine a lot of you would want to do that, then you're going to take a little bit more time to figure out how much border fabric you need. You can do multiple border pieces per hooping. You'll need to know how big of a hoop area you have to see how many you can fit in a hooping. In the hoop that I'm working in, I can get 4 of the small border pieces or 2 of the large border pieces into 1 hooping, and I can get all 4 of those corner tiles into 1 hooping. When you're figuring out how many will fit into 1 hooping, make sure you're leaving 1/4 inch all the way around each border piece. So you want to be sure that you're leaving 1/2 inch between pieces. So between this border piece and this border piece, I need to be sure there's 1/2 inch between here because I need 1/4 inch seam allowance on each piece. And that's really easy to think, oh, I need 1/4 inch, but remember you need 1/4 inch on each piece, so you actually need 1/2 inch between these 2 pieces. Now, we will talk about some different options for piecing these together. If you're using the method where you're using no seam allowance, then of course you can get your pieces closer together. But I'm going to piece mine with a seam allowance, so I need to be sure to leave that space. So to calculate this, I know I need 3 hoopings for the smaller borders because there's 12 border pieces, 4 in each. I need 4 hoopings for the larger borders because there's 8 pieces, 2 in each, and then 1 for the corner tiles. Again, I'm going to figure out how much fabric I need. I need 28 inches of fabric with it doubled so that I can get my 8 hoopings, or pardon me, so I can get all 8 of my pieces here. And then I'm going to have 8 inches left over. That 8 inches is almost enough for the binding, as we'll see on the next one. So you can also, when you're thinking about buying this yard, you could buy just a little bit more and get your binding out of this same piece of fabric. Let's talk about calculating the binding. For the backing for this particular piece, let me go back here. You need about a 32-inch square, so 1 yard should take care of you for your backing, unless you're going to do a variation on the size. But if you're doing the standard size, you need about a yard for the backing. The binding, I'm going to round that 32 inches up to about 33 inches just to be safe when I'm calculating how much binding I need. Then I've got 4 sides, so that's 132 inches total. Then I need to divide that by the width of fabric, the amount of usable fabric I'm going to get, which means I need 3.14 strips. But of course I can't cut a 1.14 strip, so I have to cut 4 strips. Depending on how wide you cut your binding strips, I always cut my binding strips 2.5 inches, so that means I need 10 inches of fabric for my binding. So like I said, I had 8 inches left over from this yard. If I want to try to scrimp that size a little bit, I might be able to get it out of a yard or a yard and a quarter for sure to be able to get how much fabric I need for that binding. And then you can also, I like to round up a little bit just to be safe. So I'm not going to buy 10 inches, I'm going to round up a little bit or to the nearest purchasable amount, maybe 1/3 of a yard or whatever you'd like to buy. Now, if you don't want to do all that math, you can also use an online binding calculator. So this is one that I found at Block Central, which is a great little website. And at this Block Central, you tell it what's the length of your quilt. So my quilt is about 32 inches long. Let's round it to 33 to be safe. What's the width? And how wide is my fabric? And this is usable width. So I'm going to say I have 42 inches usable width. It's going to automatically assume that you are using a 2.5 inch strip, and then it will tell you, it'll calculate for you how many strips you need to cut. So this calculator will tell me cut 4 strips 2.5 inches wide. So if you want to save yourself some time, you can use one of these great little online calculators. Okay, now that we've calculated our fabric, we're ready to stitch out the designs. When I embroider my blocks for a tiling scene, I always use this particular combination of stabilizer. I use 1 layer of a soft tearaway, I use 1 layer of a crisp, heavy tearaway, and then I hoop that together with the background fabric. And I'm going to spray those layers together with temporary adhesive spray. That temporary adhesive spray, to me, I love that extra insurance, and also because I typically, when I'm doing a tiling scene, am not going to stitch everything at one time. I like the fact that that temporary adhesive spray will keep my layers together as I'm preparing things, and I may work ahead, prep my pieces, and then stitch a bunch of them, and then I may put it aside for a while and come back to it. So that temporary adhesive spray will keep the fabrics together in between my stitching times. Now, why do I use 1 layer of soft and 1 layer of crisp? The crisp tearaway is what really helps these blocks cut evenly, so when we cut them apart into pieces, it helps when you've got that really crisp tearaway behind it so that it cuts straight. It also really helps keep everything nice and flat and perfectly smooth. And really, when I'm stitching a design like this, I want to use 2 layers of tearaway because that does give me the extra insurance, so that as I'm using a tearaway, you'll know that it gets a little perforated as that needle's going through it over and over. And so I need that second layer to keep it from getting too perforated. And the soft tearaway makes a great second layer for 2 reasons. One, the crisp tearaway is really crisp, and it's a little harder to hoop 2 layers of that crisp tearaway because it's so crisp, it's kind of hard to get it in the hoop. But if you have 1 layer crisp and 1 layer soft, it hoops pretty easily. Also, the soft tearaway doesn't perforate as quickly or as easily as the crisp tearaway. So the combination of the 2 is perfect. The soft tearaway prevents that needle perforation, so you have something that stays behind the stabilizer as it's stitching, and the crisp tearaway provides that really flat surface that you need. So once I've got that stabilizer put together, I'm going to hoop all of these layers together as one. And then I'm going to stitch my design following my thread chart for my colors. Now when you're choosing your background fabric, the collection will have a recommended color. In this particular collection, it's a sepia background color. I'm currently working on a second one, got the sepia one done. I'm working on a second one on a white background. So I'll let you know how it looks when it's done. The stitches on this design, though, you can see in this picture, and if you've looked up close at the image, or if you've started stitching yours, a lot of the background fabric shows through. So you need to consider that when you're choosing your fabric, that background fabric is really going to show through, and it will change the way the design looks if you change that background fabric. So if you want it to look just like the picture, you really do need to choose a background fabric that's similar to the one that you see in the picture. And in this case, the sepia one does kind of give it that vintage feel. I'm really anxious to see how it ends up looking when it's done on white. Now, here's a little trick, and it will make more sense in a second. But when you get to the last color change, which is what is called the seam stitch or the cut stitch, it'll be called seam/cut stitch on your thread chart. When you get to that section, use black thread in the bobbin. So if you've been using white thread, use black, or something that contrasts with your background fabric. So if your background fabric's black, use white. But you want something that's different than what you've been using for the rest of the design so that you can see it. You really want it to show up. And it's not going to show up in your design, so it's okay if it's a really bright, bold color that's contrasting for that last thread color. So when you're done, you're actually going to be able to see that stitching line from the back side. And when we get to showing you how we cut this apart, you'll see why that's helpful to have that stitching line showing. In the needle, for that very last color, which is the seam stitch, I want you to use a color that matches your background fabric. So you want something that is as close to the color of your background fabric as possible. You do still want to be able to see it, but you'll be able to see the stitch. So choose something that's very, very close. Okay, before I go any further, I have a couple questions over here, so I'll just give you I'll just pause for a second and answer the question. The website for the calculator is blockcentral.com. So one question is, what's the website for the calculator? It's blockcentral.com. Is the info in with the designs? Most of this info that we're talking about here as far as the basic step-by-steps is in the design. So the basic information you need for creating the designs is in there. There is instructions. But one of the reasons we do these webinars is some things are easier understood when you're listening to somebody. So some of those little tips and tricks you won't find in the instructions, but the basic step-by-step is included. A question, what is crisp stabilizer? Is it heavy cutaway? The crisp stabilizer that I'm using is a tearaway. The one I use is called Eco Tear, and it's a really crisp, heavyweight tearaway. But doesn't have to be Eco Tear, it could be another heavy tearaway is what you're looking for. But heavy tearaways are different, so you want to feel it when you're looking at and making a purchase and deciding which one you want. You want one that feels really crisp, like paper, but it's thicker than paper. And then last question I've got here, which stabilizer goes next to the fabric? I put the crisp stabilizer next to the fabric and then the softer stabilizer behind it. And honestly, I really don't have a rhyme or reason for that other than that's what I've been doing, and it seems to work really well. That crisp stabilizer against the fabric does seem to really help keep it smooth while we're stitching. Okay, so back to our blocks. When we're going to trim these blocks up to be able to piece them together, before we cut them apart or cut them out of the background fabric, we need to decide how we're going to piece it together. Now, the instructions that come with the Country Spring Lane are the method for zigzag piecing, which we'll talk about in a second. But the method I prefer personally, and this probably just comes from the fact that I'm a quilter, so that's where my comfort level is and my preference, is to piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and to actually piece it together. But you can do it either way. So if I'm going to do it the traditional piecing way, I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch around the seam stitch. If I'm doing a zigzag piecing where I'm actually going to butt the pieces together, which we'll see in a second, then I'm going to trim on that seam stitch. So I'll almost be cutting through that thread itself. So in this method, the one I'm doing when you look at the picture here is I'm using my quilt ruler. I'm lining my 1/4 inch of my quilt ruler up with that seam stitch. Now what you'll notice is that the seam stitch is not the outside of the design. The seam stitch is going to be just a hair to the inside of the design. The other trick here is do not remove the stabilizer. When you're cutting these apart, leave the stabilizer in there. We want them to stay crisp and smooth as we're piecing them together, so leave that in there. So here's a picture of it when it's finished being trimmed, and you can see for the picture purposes I did it the opposite of the way I told you to do it. On my sample I've got the black thread for my seam stitch on the top, and I use the white thread on the bottom. But my preference is, and the way I'd recommend to do it, is to use the matching thread for the seam stitch on the top and a black thread on the bobbin. And the reason being that if you use a black thread in the bobbin, you can trim it from the back side. So instead of cutting it from the front side, you're going to cut your finished piece, the 1/4 inch seam allowance, from the back side, and that black bobbin will make it really easy for you to see where you're trimming. And by using matching thread on the top, when we go to piece it together, if I'm not 100% perfect where I get these pieces pieced together, then that seam stitch is not going to show because it matches my background fabric. When you're looking at your embroidery, here's a close-up showing where the seam stitch lies in terms of where it is to the embroidery. And you can see that that seam stitch or cut stitch is just to the inside of the embroidery. So if you were to look at your thread chart that comes with your designs, you'll see that the designs are going to vary in size by just a tiny little bit. And that's based on the fact that these little stitches come out past that seam stitch. But the seam stitch lines are all exactly the same. So that way the pieces are all going to be exactly the same size when finished. And the reason they extend these little stitches out past is so that when we put this whole thing together, everything lines up perfectly. If we stopped right at the edge, you'd end up with little gaps and it would be much harder for it to line up. But by extending that embroidery just a little past that line, everything really comes together perfectly when you start to stitch it together. Now, to complete this particular project, there are going to be 48 separate embroidery designs. There's 24 main tiles and there's 24 border pieces. I've got them stacked up here one row at a time. And as we talked about earlier, you can stitch like these 4 pieces in one hooping if you choose to. Now, because that 48 is a pretty big number, unless you have a whole weekend to stitch it, you may not be able to get the whole thing done in one sitting. So one thing that you want to do is to make yourself a box specifically for your tiling project. And what I like to do is to make it really easy on myself. I go ahead and put all the threads, pull those threads that I'm using for that collection, and keep them in the box with my project. That's why I'm not having to pull the colors every time I want to do one of the tiles. They're all right there, easy to get to. I go ahead and put my USB stick that I've saved my designs in that box too. I put my thread chart in there that I've printed out, and then as I finish a tile, I'll stitch it, cut it, and put it in the box. And that way I'm ready to go on and do the next one. I keep everything organized and together. So we've been talking about our stitched blocks. Some tiling scenes have applique in them. A question that we often get asked, and it is in the instructions, but sometimes it's not 100% clear as you're getting started, is on our applique collections that are tiling scenes, is the applique stitched to a background fabric or is it just the applique fabric? They're always stitched to a background fabric. So if the tiling scene block has applique in it, all the applique fabrics that you're seeing are applique. The background fabric is not showing through. So you can use a really lightweight muslin, like foundation piecing. If you've ever done foundation quilt piecing, that would be the same type thing that you would use the same weight of fabric you would use for these tiling scenes that have applique in them. So when you're figuring and calculating your fabric, you'll need to calculate the background fabric as that muslin, and then your applique pieces you cut according to the patterns that are provided in your instructions that come with the collection. So once you have all your pieces embroidered, you're going to stitch them together. And remember, there are two methods you can choose, and with any tiling scene that we offer, it works either way. It's just a matter of what your preference is as the end result. You can do method 1, which is stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You actually stitch the blocks together, right sides together, the way you would any other type of quilt block. Or you can do method 2, where you stitch the pieces embroider the pieces, cut them on the cut line, and then you butt them together and zigzag over the edges. In this method, there is no seam allowance. So this is my preferred method, and that's to stitch the blocks together in the quilting method with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're doing it this way, you're going to place the pieces right sides together. So here I'm adding this long border piece to the first tile in this row. We're going to place them right sides together. We're going to align the edges and the seam lines. Now if we cut accurately, that 1/4 inch, that should line up perfectly. Your 1/4 inch seam allowance and your seam line or cut line should line up exactly on top of each other. Because you have that nice stiff stabilizer in there, these actually will line up together really nicely. It's like putting pieces of paper together to line them up, as opposed to fabric, because of that stabilizer keeping it crisp. So it does make it really easy to put them together. Now once we've put them right sides together, we're going to stitch it together just inside the seam line. So it's going to be just a little bit, just a 1 thread width larger than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're using a 1/4 inch foot, it should line up almost perfectly when you go to put it together. And the 1/4 inch foot that I like to use is one that actually has a guard on the side. And many machines do have a 1/4 inch foot that has this little guard on the side. And the reason I like that, it makes it really easy for me to line that up, because I can almost push the fabric up against that guard, and that keeps it straight. It keeps it from slipping out, because it's got that little piece kind of holding it in place. But you can see in this close-up photo here that the needle is literally just 1 thread's width to the other side of that seam stitch. That will keep that seam stitch from showing when you press the blocks open. You'll be able to see that the seam stitch, the guide stitch that you created, doesn't show. However, by using a matching thread when you're matching your background fabric, if you do miss it by just a tiny little bit, it won't show. So that's one of the advantages of matching that background fabric. Now once you've pieced these, as you stitch each piece together, you're going to remove the stabilizer just from the seam allowance. You don't need to take it out from the entire design, but you do want to remove it from the seam allowance. So here I've removed it from the border piece, just along the seam allowance there, and then from the tile piece along the seam allowance. Now you notice on the border piece, it's really easy and nice and clean, because that's a straight line. When it comes to the tile pieces, it's a little bit more challenging, because as you're taking the stabilizer away from these embroidered edges, they're not perfectly straight, because remember, they're going out past that seam stitch. So it takes a little bit more to get that off, but this makes a really good TV project. What I'll do is stitch all these a row together, and then as I'm watching TV, I'll tear away from that little seam allowance. And the reason that you want to tear the seam allowance stabilizer away is because you want to press this seam open. We really do need to press this seam open in order for these to lay flat. In traditional quilting, you typically don't press your seams open. You typically press them to one side. But because there's so much bulk here with the embroidery already there, we want to have that as flat as possible, which means we do need to press it open. I'd recommend here using a small wooden pressing tool to help you press so that you don't put your finger there as you're pressing that seam open for each piece. So what you'll do is you're going to stitch a row at a time together. So stitch a row, and then after you stitch all the rows, you're going to stitch the rows together. It is important that you sew the correct piece to the correct piece. It won't look right if you put the wrong piece in the wrong place. So you can think of it a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, except it's a lot less fun if you put the piece in the wrong place because you have to take it apart. So I would definitely recommend that you check and double check, make sure everything's right. I use stacks to help me keep everything organized, or you can use bulldog clips to clip them together and make sure they stay in the right order. You can even pin the number onto it if you want to be sure you've got them in the right order. But just double check as you're stitching it together, is this the right piece that I'm supposed to be stitching? Now we're ready to stitch the rows together. We've done a row, we're ready to stitch it to another row. We want to be sure all those seam allowances are pressed open, and now we're going to line these up together. So we're going to line 2 rows up together. We want to be sure that we're lining the seams up with each other. So this would be more like traditional quilting where the seams are getting lined up with each other, and you're also lining up the edges. Because it is stiffer with that stabilizer in it, it's actually fairly easy to get it lined up and keep it straight. But if you want to pin it, you can. I typically don't, but you can pin it if you want to. Just be sure, whichever method you use, whether you pin or you don't pin, that you are checking it as you go and making sure that as you're stitching down that row and stitching the 2 rows together, you're making sure that your seams line up. Have a question, and the question is, can you use a regular 1/4 inch foot or should you use an even feed foot for this project? When you're piecing them together, you should be fine with a 1/4 inch foot. You shouldn't need an even feed foot for piecing them together. And the reason you shouldn't typically need an even feed foot is because the stabilizer is still there in your project as you're stitching it. You're not removing the stabilizer from the seam allowance till after you've stitched that seam together, so you should be fine with a regular foot. Now, when we get to the quilting it together, then an even feed foot is a really good idea. But for just piecing it, you should be fine with the 1/4 inch foot. Okay, now the other method, which is to stitch the blocks together without a seam allowance. With this method, you're trimming on the seam/cut line. And as you trim exactly on that line, you're going to get the finished size of the block. And then you're going to butt these 2 pieces together and zigzag over them. So you'll want to use an edge stitch foot or a foot that has that line right down the middle of your foot. It really helps if you have one that actually has a guide to it that's keeping your pieces lined up exactly right. But if you don't have one that actually has a little physical guide, as long as it has a printed visual guide, that can help you make sure that you're keeping those 2 pieces perfectly even down the center of that presser foot as you're stitching it. And then you're going to zigzag. Make sure that zigzag is wide enough to catch both pieces well, but not so wide that it's going to show underneath your ribbon or whatever finishing method you're going to choose. You'll want to use a matching thread to the background fabric. If you're choosing this method where you're butting the pieces together to stitch them and zigzagging them together, you will definitely want to cover that when you're done, unless you just like the look of having the zigzag stitches there. But you'll want to cover it with a ribbon or some sort of trim when you're done, which we'll look at in here in just a second. The next step is to quilt these layers together. You're going to create a quilt sandwich by layering first the backing, then the batting, and then the quilt top on top of that, just like you would for a regular quilt. Your backing and batting should be about 1 to 2 inches larger than the top on all sides. And when you're quilting this, my recommendation is that you quilt it by stitching in the ditch. So this is where that even feed foot or walking foot is going to come in really handy because you're going to stitch right in the ditch to stitch those layers together. If you want to get creative and stitch and quilt through the tiles, you can, but because of the stabilizer that's in them, you're not going to really get that nice puffy quilting look even if you do stitch onto them, because we're leaving the stabilizer in them. So by stitching in the ditch, we're quilting it where it's naturally going to give you the curve that you want it to have. Whereas if you were to try to quilt through that stabilizer, you're just not going to get that quilted look that you're probably trying to achieve. So stitching in the ditch is typically your best option with these projects. Now finally, you're going to finish the block, and you have to decide how you want to finish it, what look you want when you're done. The first look is to have no panes. So it's actually just stitched together, and from a distance, if it's a far enough distance, you might not even see the tiles right away. And as you get closer, you'll see that it's tiled together, but the pieces line up to each other. Now, there's some advantages and disadvantages to this method. The advantage to this method is you have it done. Once you've pieced it together, it's done. I also just like the way it looks. The disadvantage is you do have to be pretty careful that you line everything up and you stitch it properly so that those pieces do line up. And if you have any little imperfections and that bothers you and you don't want your friends to see them, then it will show. So you may want to choose one of the other methods if that bothers you, that there may be some places where maybe it's not quite as perfect as you had hoped for. If you're going to do this method with no panes or without putting anything over the edges, then you have to use the seam allowance method, where you're leaving the 1/4 inch seam allowance and piecing it together that way if you want this look. The next one is to use a ribbon, and you can use, typically we use a 1/4 inch ribbon. You can fuse the ribbon on, and it's done in this project. It's not stitched on at all, it's just fused on using a 1/4 inch fusible web tape, like Seam a Seam 2 is my favorite one. You can get it in a 1/4 inch tape. It's sticky and fusible, so it makes it really easy to apply, and then you're going to iron those ribbons on. Now you'll want to think about it before you start ironing them on, because depending on how you want the layers to look, do you want your pieces going across to be under the ones on the top, or do you want to take the time to basket weave them so it's not exactly the same at every corner? It's up to you. But once you're done, you're done. You've ironed it on and you're done. Now, it will eventually come up. It is a permanent, but it's only so permanent because it is a fusible. However, I have found that it will eventually lift depending on how much you move your project, if you store it between seasons, but you can always iron it back down and replace it if it starts to wear away. If you hang this on the wall and nobody ever touches it, you never move it, you never fold it, it won't come loose. But if you fold it away for every Christmas or every holiday, it may start to come loose and you'll have to re-iron it back on. If you don't want to do that, where you're having to re-iron it back on, then you can stitch it down. When you're doing it this method, do still use the fusible web tape and press it in place first. Then come back and zigzag over the center of your ribbon. You can use a different decorative stitch. If you don't want to zigzag, you could use a different stitch. You also can edge stitch the ribbon, but let me forewarn you that if you're going to do the edge stitching of your ribbon, that requires some patience and precision. So if those aren't your forte, you might prefer the zigzag method. The binding will be done after your ribbons are applied. So if you're going to put ribbons on, you're going to do that before you put the binding on. Otherwise, you'll be disappointed when you get to the edge and you realize there's no place for the end of that ribbon to go. So make sure you do that first before you bind it. Let's look through some collections that we have available. I'll just run through these quickly. Again, the recording will be available, and also you can find these on our website. So if you go to our website, you search for the word tiling, just type in tiling up here in the corner. And then if you want to see just the collections, you click the collections box, and that will show you our tiling collections. But we have several to choose from. We have the Visions of, which there's a spring, summer, fall, and winter. We have the Vintage group, and these are all applique. So all of these are completely applique. You'd use the background fabric that doesn't show, and all the fabric you're seeing here is appliqued on. And these were designed to look like vintage travel posters. We have one that's called "And to All a Good Night." This one is a fairly quick one to stitch up if you don't do the borders. The borders are fairly intensive as far as time, but if you want something that's really quick, you can just do the middle one because you can see there's not the level of detailing in the stitch. So if you're looking for a project you can finish up pretty quickly, this is a good one. I also really like is how this project was finished. We used a gold lame ribbon, and it really looked nice when you put the whole thing together. Picturesque Peacock has been one of our most popular tiling collections. It has a couple of options. If you have a large jumbo size embroidery hoop, you can do this top option, which has the arch. If you don't have this size hoop where you can do a design this large, then you can finish it off here, and you can do the border pieces across the top. But I really do like that cathedral look at the top. This is the Asian Cranes landscape. This one is also done with the applique, so the fabrics that you see here are actually appliqued onto a background fabric. And one of the things I love about this one is that the border is not an embroidered border. This is just an added solid border. It really frames off this collection nicely. You can see this collection is the one we were doing the close-up of where we didn't add any painting to it, just let the embroidery show. This is our most popular tiling collection that we've had so far. In fact, probably a lot of you have it. It's been an evergreen for us, and everyone seems to really like it. It's called Dashing Through the Snow. This is another one that has fairly light stitches, so it goes together more quickly than one that has a lot of applique. So if you've got one that you're wanting to try to finish for a special project, this is one that goes together pretty quickly. The Nativity tiling scene. This one does have some pieces where the background fabric does show. So in this case, the background fabric is black, and then the other applique fabrics are appliqued on. And that's explained in the instructions. What I like about this particular tiling scene, it's a little different in that there are lots of options in how you can put it together. So the main way that it's put together is this tall way, and it has a Bible verse in the center, and then you can see that it has a manger scene here, and then the shepherds and wise men arranged in this method. But you can also do a long one, or you can do one here where it's got the line work angels across the top. So lots of options in this collection. And then finally, this is the poinsettia tiling scene, and I have failed to put the number up here for you, but I can tell you it's 12431. And this tiling scene I love because it was designed in mind that it was also to be very versatile, that you could use sections of the blocks. So I want to show you some options with that, and that's using partial tiling scenes. Now this one was specifically designed to be done this way, but you can do that with other tiling collections as well. So you can see this is the full-size collection, but by leaving off the top row and adding the border to the top row, you get a different look. You can also come in and do just 2 rows and add a different border, and you get a different look. Or finally, you can use single tiles. So you can imagine these as single tiles framed or wrapped around a canvas and just hanging together as a grouping to really give you a different artistic look by using just a portion of your tiling scene. So you can do this with other tiling scenes. Experiment with which little piece out of this could I pull out, and it would still look good by itself. Well, we've come to the end of our presentation, and sorry I've run over by a couple minutes, but if you have time and you have questions, I will be on the line for a while. Please feel free to type your questions right into the line, into the questions box there, and I'll be happy to address those. Thank you all so much for attending. You will get that webinar recording link within a couple of days. It'll also be posted to our blog. If you have any questions, you can use the reply to email address that's came to you when you received your webinar login. You can reply directly back to that email address if you have any questions about today's presentation or other questions about tiling scenes. We'd love to help you with those. Well, thanks all for your thank yous. I enjoyed having you in class too. I really appreciate you joining me today. Question, if the sepia is the background, what color for the borders? For this particular collection, for this Country Spring Lane, let me see if I've got one pulled up that shows an image that shows it. We did these borders in a pale green, actually very similar to what you see here on the screen, the sort of pale green color. You can experiment. I did some experimenting just visually on screen, and I think a dark brown border would also look nice with this particular collection, but it was designed to be done with a pale green, sort of a sage green, I guess. Here's one that shows. Let me pull this over. You can see here the sage green, and then we use the brown for the ribbons. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and log off. But again, you can reach me by replying to that email that you received your webinar information from if you have any further questions, and thanks again so much. Oh, one more question. What other options other than ribbon frames are there? One of the other things that we have used is a decorative trim like you would see in home dec, like a flat decorative trim, and you can stitch that. When you're doing the decorative trim, it can be a little tricky to sew on, so you may want to glue it on or use an iron-on to get it on. Because of the bulk, it can be a little bit tricky to sew on. If you've got a really good foot for sewing on a trim or a cord, you can do that. But a decorative cord or trim can really look nice for finishing those off. I've also seen some samples where people have used a combination. So they use the ribbon, like on this peacock. Let's see if I pull that up. On this peacock, the sample that we actually have hanging in the office, we have ribbon for the main panes here, but then around the outside edge of the separation between the blue border and the background tile pieces, that is done with a like an upholstery trim, a decorative flat-backed upholstery trim. One other option that I've seen that Micah, who works here in our office, did is she did a version of this tiling with the cranes that she actually wrapped over a canvas, and at each corner of this she put a upholstery tack right in the corner. So she didn't cover the whole area, she just covered the corners with upholstery tacks, and that looked really cool. Another question, can fusible ribbon be used? Yes, if you have ribbon that's already fusible, you can definitely use that. We just make ours fusible using the seam a seam too, but if you've got some that's already fusible, you've saved yourself a step, so that works really well. The fabrics recommended for dashing through the snow, what are those? The fabrics that we used in Dashing Through the Snow are very similar to what we used with the Country Spring Lane, and that is a sepia, kind of tannish brown background. The border that we used was a black fabric. These are quilting cottons. So a quilting cotton fabric is what we're going to recommend to stitch on, but color-wise, a sepia tone for the background fabric. These are all stitched on a sepia, and then a black border. Okay, thanks again, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Please feel free to email me if you need anything, and thanks for participating today. Of course, we'd also love to hear what other topics you'd like to see in these webinar series that we're working on, so please feel free to provide that information in your feedback as well. Thanks again, and have a great night.